Welcome everyone to the Ops Show, where we bring you the trials and tribulations, collaborations, and automations from the world of DevOps and the developer experience, as well as my broken glasses in the chronicles of stay-at-home life. Today our guest is Nima Boscarino, a software developer, educator, and tech ethicist. I'm really excited about this show, and I think episode 4 is going to be the best yet. Today we're going to do a deep dive into the impact side of tech and talk about ethics and tech. Nima teaches kids to code, supports underrepresented groups in technology, and cares deeply about the ethics side of things. Welcome, Nima. It's great to have you.
Hi, Tristan. It's nice to be on here. Yeah, as you said, I'm very interested in tech ethics, as well as web development, computer science, and education. It's sort of where I fit into things.
Awesome. It's been a little bit of a sad week in my home state of Minnesota, where we've seen an unarmed U.S. citizen killed by police, and there's been a lot of riots and a lot of conversation online about this. As you think a lot about ethics in tech, a great starting point would be hearing your thoughts on how to support more nonviolence with technology, and any examples and things you're seeing out there that we could find and learn from and help support.
Yeah, so I guess I sort of go against the grain in terms of seeing how technology can be used to address those kinds of issues. Obviously, there are sort of the big ones like body cams and kind of supporting just more transparency. I think social media has definitely been a positive force in increasing kind of the word and exposing more people to the injustice that happens. So I think those are important things to look at, but it's also important for me to see that like the root of the problem is racism. Like that is sort of the crux of the thing for me. And there is this concept of people in technology, I think, trying to use technology to solve problems and trying to see everything through a technical lens. This for me is very much of a human problem. Abstracting it out to technology, for me, seems as if it sort of gets away from the deeper issue of just systemic racism. And this, to me, seems to be a time to actually have accountability in police forces. Whether that comes out to be, body cameras, like I'm in full support of that. But I think honesty and openness and maybe a more rigorous system of like recruiting and hiring officers and keeping them accountable for their actions. Because many of the times that I've seen this stuff kind of pop up in the news, there's not a one-time case for the officer in question or for the department in question. There's usually like a history of offenses, and
even just like the tracking of, like you would in a startup team, almost of like knowing that having accountability within, applying what happens in business to other organizations, so that there's actually that accountability and transparency of records and history, and also continued education and helping support and lead towards a more a dialogue first sort of approach to a lot of this stuff. Because if you're saying it's not actually technology itself that it's really the societal thing, then I guess communication and that dialogue is going to be of the utmost importance. And with social media and just being able to share those sorts of opinions and stories and keep this dialogue and debate open, it's just super, super important. And especially as we're in a stay-at-home environment and just kind of coming out of it, but we'll see it for the rest of the year. Have those conversations online is going to be more and more necessary, huh?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think maybe one of the places where technology can have an impact is more making sure that the conversations stay on point, and that there is like a plan moving forward. I mean, we live in an era where like attention is already so hard to keep. And it's almost as if like the news cycle pushes us through tragedies, and sort of just bombards us with like new things to look at every day. And what happened recently is not a new event, right? If anything, it's just another reminder of just this pattern of tragedies. And where technology I think can fit in is the companies that are in charge of the social networks, so the companies that are in charge of the the news media. They could use technology as a way of like continuing to bring this stuff to light. I think like using tech as a medium for narrative. One of the things that like say the Globe and Mail did, and it has done over the years, is they run kind of like, and the Globe and Mail is a newspaper in Canada. They run like news like series where they'll tackle big kind of honestly like heavy and topics that like need to be talked about. It's just the missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. And they'll tackle that from like a bunch of different perspectives, and have that stuff online and use media like Twitter to like propagate that stuff and continue to like bring the conversation back. I think it's just not as simple as saying like what tech can solve this. I definitely think I see issues with trying to view technology as this like politically neutral like tool that can be used to fix things. When the problem here I think is people, and is the institution of prejudice and hate and supremacy.
I found that when I zoom out and think about the big picture, the long term, and I think about human history, like we've always been divided. We've always been kind of dumb and do things that are dumb, frankly, and not like helpful to others. I think one of the things that I've always also assumed is that technology is not like a solution, if often is what elevates the divisiveness. And like I think you look back in history, whether it was forms of warfare and cannons and these kinds of technologies that were thought of as technology in their time, or you think of the internet, which is thought of technology in our time, it both brings people together because it elevates a set of voices and helps people rally around a set of causes, but it also polarizes perspectives quite dramatically. And we've gotten to a point where I think you're bang on, where it's hard if the technology doesn't take a bipartisan view of how to share multiple kinds of perspectives, that you ultimately end up elevating that divisiveness, and it could be on one side or the other, and both sides think each other's wrong. But if you can actually use technology to balance that out and say, hey, look, here, to your point, that Globe and Mail example, here's 5 different perspectives on that. Well, now what technology is doing is bringing us together and helping us empathize with another perspective that maybe we didn't see out of the box. And it's less about us being right, and it's more about us trying to like find a common ground.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
I totally agree. One of the things that I think of when it comes to technology is that like technology is often like built to solve some problem, or like if we were to frame it as like a product exists to hit some point, and you need user stories, you need a goal, you need to figure out like what are we really trying to solve here. Something that I'll be completely honest is sort of a bit nebulous in my mind is like, when people have these kinds of conversations, like what is the goal of introducing technology into this sphere? Is it to increase public knowledge of the just the injustices that happen? Like if that's the goal, then social media does a great job of it, and that's great. Right. Is the goal to hold like police departments accountable, right? Then yeah, like body cameras make sense to me there, right? Is the goal instead to like increase just kind of like education, to tackle the perpetuation of like systemic oppression, right? Then I don't think the technology is necessarily the tool there, or like I don't think it would be like the first thing that I would reach to, right? I think like like a system-wide like education reform. That's kind of like one of the big things. Or demilitarizing the police forces, right? Like this might honestly be an opportunity to say, hey, you know what, let's remove technology from the equation here, right? Like the police forces in the States, and I say this as a Canadian, so everything I say should be taken with like multiple grains of salt. But like the police forces in the United States are among like the most militarized forces in the world, which to me doesn't make a ton of sense, because if you take like the community that you're supposed to protect and serve, right, and you start off by like arming yourself as a small army, right, you're approaching the problem as the problem is the community, right? This isn't like, oh, let's help the community thrive. This is there's like a view of we need to be militarized because we're fighting something in the community. And I think that's a place where maybe a conversation about technology sort of lies, in that like technology, I think, tends to like color our worldview, right? And the more we arm ourselves with tech, in this case, I mean, the tech for me is like surveillance technology that the police forces use, like all kinds of like predictive policing technology. Guns in general are technology. Like that kind of stuff, I think begins a mindset of like an oppressor versus an oppressed.
We've focused on that enforcement level, that side of technology, and like anything from the atom bomb to warfare, there's been a lot of that enforcement technology put into, let's say, the government, where a lot of the societal technology, even down to, let's say, waiting in line for the DMV, and when you could get your license online with certain verifications, that part lacks a lot, at least in the US.
I mean, this exists in private businesses as well, I think. I mean, if you ever listen to someone like Simon Stenyak, and he talks about the concepts of servant leadership, a lot of what you're saying, I think, obviously it's on a much bigger scale. It's much more polarized, with guns on one side and technology and information on the other side. These are the tools. But you even look in a business, and the idea of servant leadership is really to start with the assumption that the community, the organization, is right. And he breaks it down to some really interesting and human elements in some of his talks online, which I encourage people to look at. And it starts around the premise of like, ideas like cortisone and like the actual physical functions of your body, and why people react to stress in certain ways, and how that stress induction creates a certain set of divisive perspectives not in any group of people. And once you get beyond 150 people, and you can't maintain healthy relationships anymore, I mean, it's been proven, this just gets to a whole other scale. I mean, I think you can see this trend of technology in smaller buckets as well. And one of the things I try to think about a lot is, if you look at it in a smaller bucket, can you start to break down some of these problems into bite-sized pieces, find potential solutions, and at the same time, then apply that to the macro effect, the bigger thing, because it's really hard to tackle on the grand scale.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? If you look at that, if Simon says 50, and or I've seen other things where tribes ended up capped at 100, 150, then it's like all of a sudden we've been thrown into this global culture, global environment, and it's been a huge challenge creating a dialogue that is positive, that isn't polarizing, and finding other avenues. I think there was even Sean Parker, of Napster and Facebook, started a company called Brigade, which is now defunct, but had a really interesting way that they were trying to encourage a political dialogue between people, as well as like help you answer questions. You'd sign up, you'd answer questions about, let's say, some of the things you cared about, and then you would be, hey, you fit closer to like these politicians in your area, and these are the people that you could vote for, but you like maybe agree more on this, but you disagree less on this. And it kind of helped provide some clarity and context. And it was kind of sad to see that go and not work quite the way they wanted, because I thought that's where maybe technology could come into play, is like a layer on top of social media that helps guide you and educate you. Because right, I think the education is just as big as the dialogue when it comes to these greater global challenges and even localized challenges.
No, I think that's really interesting. I hadn't heard of brigade before. This is a really interesting concept, but I think it does bring up sort of, I guess for this, I have to give like a little bit of background about myself. Like my view on technology is maybe like a bit more Luddite than most web developers. Like
Unpack that. You're using a big word that I don't understand. Simplify that. Tell me what that word means.
So Luddite, it's basically, I mean, I can't remember the history exactly, but the Luddites are a group of people who I believe were, the narrative is that they were anti the Industrial Revolution. If I remember correctly, it's more that they were cynical on the way the technology was being used, and again that divisive effect of introducing technology into a society, and how like by nature, maybe by nature isn't the right word, but like on a regular sort of situation, English textile workers in the 19th century.
So they had a more practical approach to, like, they were trying to reduce their technology down to a set of just like real world principles, like more like not leaning into the modern era, saying, hey, how do we stay simple in our lifestyle?
Exactly. And for me, I take a point of view where personally I think that a lot of things are, over teched, like over engineered. And I'm not saying that like technology doesn't have a place in society, and it very much does. But I think
we haven't even evolved, right? Like almost like you're saying, it's like these kind of innate human functions and connections that matter.
Yeah, well, I think people underestimate the value of people, and I think people underestimate like the effects that techifying something has. So some like books are really neat to look at, or things like there's a book called Weapons of Math Destruction.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it's fantastic, and in sort of a similar vein, but more focused on women's issues, is Invisible Women. And then there's another book called Race After Technology. These are sort of all three different books that look at the way that viewing societal problems through a lens of technology abstracts us away from tackling the actual problems, because math has this tendency to make us think that we understand something, and it has this tendency to make us think that like, oh, we can find a pretty simple solution to something. So say that we're talking about like political stuff, right? One of the things that Weapons of Math Destruction sort of brings up is like, if you try to attach algorithms to people's like very complicated political leanings, it can make us feel as if like, oh, like we can put ourselves into this bucket, we can use this data to classify ourselves, and now I can make these decisions. And we're not really looking at all the biases that are introduced into those models, right? We're not looking at the fact that like data can be used to lie, or data is really easy to misunderstand if you just don't have that background. So Weapons of Mass Destruction looks at this from a high level, kind of like data being used for, whether it's on purpose or accidentally perpetuating inequality. I think, how big data increases inequality and threatens democracy. Invisible Women looks at tech and data specifically as the world is sort of viewed through tech, which is explicitly a male lens historically, right? And whenever we're participating in technology, it can be important to look at it through the fact that technology isn't this thing that just exists in time, right? It's got a whole bunch of history baked into it. So Invisible Women looks at what kind of male history is built in, and then Race After Technology looks at what kind of like racial history and racial bias is baked in to the technology that we use and what effects it has.
Wow.
I bring these things up just because like it is important to me to like instead of like reaching immediately for like, oh, how can tech fix this? Tech is just a way to like enhance our abilities, right? And tech is just a way to sort of increase our throughput as people. then and it is important to look at like what it is that we're producing in the first place, right? If we live in a systemically oppressive society and we build technology, chances are that we're like infusing those thoughts into that tech, right? In sort of obscure ways as well. I don't mean that there isn't, like help that tech can offer. But I personally, I just don't think that tech should be the first thing that we reach for. Right? On the other hand, like dialogue and conversation, like those are sort of bigger for me. Legislation for me is really big, right? Like how do we organize a group of people? Like I think that that's what legislation is for, right? And that's what regulation is for, right? And kind of trying to keep people within stuff that we've decided as a society makes sense, right? And sometimes that stuff doesn't make sense. Like the stuff that's written on paper doesn't make sense, and it's important to raise those conversations, right? Discuss that and include as many people and as diverse of a group of people in those conversations, right?
Yeah. I mean, that goes back to what we were saying earlier about sharing the different perspectives as well. And I couldn't agree more. There's so much good stuff to unpack there. Like, first of all, I think it's a contrarian view to take this minimalist technology idea. It's like the best technology is no technology. Like if we really need technology to abstract us, we got core problems that we're not addressing. I think the second thing that I heard you say there, which is so awesome, and I talk about a lot, is like, a leaner mentality to how you implement technology is valuable, and a smaller amount of data is often more informative. So like Malcolm Gladwell's thin slicing techniques that he talks about, where it's important to be able to use your intuition, because your intuition is one of the most powerful things, and the more data you have, the less you use your intuition, your creativity to empathize with the circumstances and bring that human element back. But one of the things I've always been challenged with is there's a balance between this and then the organizational and human challenge. Things like, I think it's Parkinson's law of triviality, what we commonly call a bike shed in software engineering, where, science has shown that an organization will spend their time on the most trivial, or a disproportionate amount of time on the most trivial issues. And so like, when you go to the other extreme, you also run into these other balances. One of the things I'd love to know, because I know you spent a lot of time thinking about how to educate software engineers, building curriculum to teach them, and you rightly so put it that maybe we're implementing our biases in the technology. What are some of the things that you are implementing in different curriculums, training, and just like what you're passing down to future technologists that you think help them to embrace these ideas and both be successful in a job market which is very capitalistic, but also then like balance out that other side of it as well?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. That's sort of like the eternal struggle, really.
Yeah.
So so I was an instructor at a web development boot camp. And I mean, the way that like boot camps are structured is there isn't a ton of flexibility in what you're teaching. There's some benefit to that, and there's definitely some drawbacks to it. One of the things that the boot camp that I worked at, and still like continue to kind of work with, is there is some space for for students to explore and for instructors to bring in kind of like new ideas during lectures and some activities for reflection. I think the things that have been most helpful in kind of like broadening people's kind of sense of society and social impact in technology is reminding people more than once, like on a recurring basis, that development and that technology is not an apolitical action. Like you don't have to put your politics at the door when you engage in technology. And in fact, in my opinion, it might even be your duty to bring that with you. Right? For me, coding is inherently like technology is inherently a political thing. So, in the web development bootcamp, I used to run sort of like an advanced lecture, it was like a 2-hour workshop session where I would have everybody kind of go through like a series of like workshop style discussions on interesting kind of like, you have to start with like the quirky things that pop up in technology. Like, oh, have you realized that like you spend a lot more time on Facebook? Like, wow, that's weird, right? And then you work your way up to, you know, the more kind of hard hitting and definitely like sort of harder to stomach issues that technology brings in. So I got a lot of positive feedback from students in those kinds of, like in those sessions. I would run them every month. And they were just aimed at students. So after a while, I ended up like opening it up to the general public. I ran a meetup series last year of like ethical tech YBR. And I think I did it like every month or so. We had like 10 sessions. We would meet up and I would invite in like a speaker to talk about some completely different concept of like social impact or like ethics in technology. I think it's really easy to like have this very like tunnel vision approach and go like, oh, okay, well, when people are talking about ethics and technology, like that means like accessibility, right? Like that's all that means. Or it just means surveillance. And that's not something that I deal with because I'm a backend developer or whatever, right? And I thought one of the benefits of bringing in like a different group of people every time, or like a different speaker every time, sort of made it more clear to people that technology is not like, oh, there's tech and then there's ethics of tech. Like ethics of tech is deeply built into technology as a whole. In almost like trivial ways, I think. I mean, we look at like the code that we write, right? And you know, maybe we think about like why are we coding in this particular programming language, right? Like, or why I use React a lot, right? I do a lot of front-end development in React. I like React, it's kind of fun. Do I like Facebook, right? Like, do I like Facebook as a company? Right? I'm not here to put words into anyone's like mouth. I don't love Facebook, right? And maybe and this is what I try to impart on my students is like, maybe we have the choice to like choose to participate in tools, and that choice is a political one, right? You know, I am working to try and learn Vue so that I can like wean myself off of Facebook. It's like those kinds of things, like the small choices that we can make, that, you know, nobody has to be a hero for. And then there are the bigger ones. Like I tried to make a big deal in terms of like my teaching to remind people that, like, you know, when you read about whistleblowers and stuff on, you know, online or on the news, like that doesn't have to be someone that's like, oh, like all the way up here, or like that only happens once in a while. Like there's injustice happening all the time, and you know, your civic duty or your like responsibility is to use the fact that you're able to voice your thoughts if you have that ability, right? Like if your job's not at risk and, you know, all that, like if you have that privilege, why not use it?
What do you think is the most constructive way to do that? Because I think one of the things I often hear in software engineers is sort of like separate the technology from the politics. I agree with you. And often people are trying to judge the merits of technology based on like the technology. Like React is great because React has this X things, not because it was built by Facebook, maybe, right? And like one of the things, again, balancing out that that paradigm. What would be the advice that you'd give to engineers to bring these things in the most constructive dialogue? Because ultimately, you can bring a voice to this discussion to be an enabler of progress or a blocker of progress, and you want to really understand which is the best situation for you to, like, the best outcome for you, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Like I'm not telling anyone to like not use React. Like if somebody is hopping into web development, the first thing I tell them to check out is React.
Yeah.
Like, yo, you're gonna love this. It's great. I think maybe the most constructive way for engineers to approach this is to normalize conversation about this stuff in the workplace. Like I encouraged my students and the people who would come to my meetups to like start these conversations at work, and maybe start a little reading group, right? Obviously, like not everyone can do that, but what I heard a lot of success about was like people bringing up things that are maybe like particularly relevant to their field. So, a lot of people who are like front-end developers would tell me that like, oh yeah, no, I brought up this accessibility issue at work, like I noticed that, there's all these bugs or whatever that we're trying to tackle with the product that we're building, but accessibility, like we're leaving out a whole group of people here, right? And that's something that we need to talk about. And so I think the most constructive thing that engineers can do is like exercise their ability to like voice these things and to treat ethical issues to be as important as like technical issues, right? Like if say somebody works at TikTok, right? TikTok recently, I think I have this here. TikTok recently had a thing where they were being criticized because they have like a filter to filter out, like I don't use TikTok, but I figure there's like a trending situation, whatever. But they'll like filter out videos of quote unquote ugly people, which is just like
out of the main feed or something.
Out of the main feed, yeah. And like there's engineers who build that stuff, right? Like
you had to put energy into implementing that opinion. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like that kind of stuff where I think
it's already happening, right? It's happening on that end. So why not talk about it in a more how to be proactive about inclusion or accessibility, or even how do our cultural values as a company or as a person then ladder up to the tools we use in a business environment.
Yeah, exactly. And I think inclusion and diversity, like that's the easiest thing to start with, right? Like you kind of look around and you go, okay, are we doing our best, right, to include people from different income brackets and different like geographies? Like, oh, does everyone live in the same neighborhood? Maybe that's something that we need to discuss. Oh, does everyone here not have children, right? Like maybe that's something that we need to discuss. And making like an actual effort to be transparent and to like invite people from communities that maybe aren't part of the community that you like siloed yourself in, right? That's something that I know I need to do a better job of. I know everyone needs to do a better job of. Right? I think
especially important with the families and having young kids at home when now that everyone's at work from home, and that's a huge pressure point right now. Boiler cooker.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I think, like, say if we were talking about like working from home now, like these are great opportunities to try and include more people who have to like usually commute from further out. Right? A lot of kind of my worldview on this stuff comes from a place of like consent and like mutual respect. Like I think technology is ethical when everybody who's participating in it or who's affected by it has had an opportunity to consent to it. Right? And when the people who are developing the technology, whether that's like technologists or whether that's more business people or product people or whatever, like when they come from a place of like understanding and respect for the people that they're working with and the people that they're impacting, right? And I think so. I don't know if I'm trying to think of like a good way to word this. Y'all were talking about how like it was Simon Sinek was talking about like
servant leadership, the number of people you can have within a healthy community.
So the number of people that you can have within a healthy community, I think that's when like it's kind of a funny thought to me that like so much of the technology that we use is built by like a small number of people, right? Like a pretty small group of people, but it affects so many. And I'm not saying I have like the answer here, but it feels really weird to say like, oh yeah, like that small group of people, like they totally understand all of this, right? And that one solution they made, oh yeah, like covers everything. You're totally right.
Interesting. Like, could you co-opt the technology more, or like open source? I know we're huge advocates of open source and open source a lot of our ops and automations and everything, but like trying to get that community feedback loop a lot more often.
There's definitely
I love that, right? Like,
there's definitely an obligation to like stimulate that, but one of the things I try to encourage, especially younger engineers, to do is to like voice their opinion with a healthy skepticism. Because like one of the things I hear from you is like, well, we should be skeptical that this is right. And whether it's something that you're building or it's the merits of capitalism and the fact that consent equals accepting a terms of service. I mean, you should be skeptical of something. And one of the most powerful ways to exercise a voice constructively is to opt out of it. Right? And so it's one of those things.
We don't have to participate all the time.
Yeah, exactly. You choose what things you contribute to. And I think it goes back to what you're saying about, React and these sorts of things too. It's like if the quality of the solution outweighs the merits of, the other side of the equation, you may choose to opt into it, accepting that you don't necessarily agree with all the principles. But I think part of it starts with a healthy skepticism, almost a contrarian skepticism, where you assume most of what you know is wrong to some degree, and you're trying to figure out how do you make it better over time, understanding that it'll never be perfect, and you need to balance out those potential pitfalls. One of the examples in recent memory of this issue is just everything that went on with ICE and some of the major tech co's. I mean, this is something that we saw very much shake up the developer community. Did you pay much attention to that or have any thoughts on that? Because that's one of the sort of, I think, really clear examples recently where ethics has really entered the technology realm, and developers exercised a voice specifically by opting out of certain things, sometimes jobs, sometimes projects.
Yeah, no, I followed that a little bit. I think in the list that I put together, there's one called notechforice.com.
Yeah.
And yeah, like I think there's, I was very happy to see that happen. To see a bunch of people get together and say, you know what, like we're fine. Like we're not, I'm not going to take the job. I'm not going to take the money. I'm not going to develop for you because we don't agree with what you're doing. And I'm excited to see that kind of stuff like continue. I think that particular situation reminded me of, I think something similar happened at Microsoft. When Microsoft had some contract with.
I think GitHub had some challenges there as well. And then there was a big open source project. I forget the one. Don't want to name names, but somebody removed a public contribution. I think it was in perhaps I don't want to name it, but somewhere in the cloud provisioning space. And it caused a lot of challenges for a lot of production systems. Like, frankly, it was a silent protest that shut down a lot of, for-profit systems. And the person who I believe was part of the catalyst for it very much was taking a position of, it's my obligation to remove this public contribution so that it's not used in those realms. And unfortunately, I have the right to do that based on my opinion. And it really sort of, I think, summarized the whole thing quite well in an action-based approach.
Yeah, no, I totally welcome that kind of stuff. Like I think people should have the right to, to their work and to choose what their labor is being used for. I mean, I would feel sick if I knew that my labor was being used for something that I just outright don't agree with. And being able to having the ability to take that ownership and say no, I'm not okay with this. I fully welcome that. There is. I've been. Do you mind if I take it back? Just I had a thought.
Please do, yeah.
So I was thinking about basically that Simon Sinek thing about communities getting too big, right? And one of the things that I wanted to mention there is when we have these sort of one size fits all products, and we're thinking okay, this company has gotten so big, they must be so big because they're good, right? They must, and not necessarily good as in morally good, but from a qualitative standpoint, the tech must be great, right? This must be a great solution. If Uber is so big, right? If they're so successful, it must be because their product is good, right? And or if I was to say the same thing about Twitter, I think there are good people, for sure. But I think that one of the things that happens when a product or its range gets so big is that margin of people that say we start off with this product targets 100 people, and 90 of those people are actually well served by the product, but maybe 10 of those people aren't, right? Maybe those 10 people are actively actually hurt by the product or left out of the product. When that thing blows up, that margin is still going to be there, and if anything, it'll just increase. And so when we look at something like Uber, or we look at something is it okay if I name names, by the way?
Totally up to you. It's totally up to you.
I'm probably never going to apply to work at Uber.
Yeah.
Their tech is cool. There's Uber or like DoorDash, or they'll look at like Twitter, like they're big products that in one way or another leave out or like close off a certain group of people or increase issues because of the mass that they've reached. So if I was to say like DoorDash, right, like DoorDash is like a food delivery service similar to like Uber Eats. Among those services, and this is not to like attack DoorDash specifically, but like among those services, part of what they do is they take menus from restaurants and put them online, right? And maybe that like works well for like when you have a small kind of user base, or you're like geographically just kind of centered around a city or two, right? Maybe a province or a state, because then like you have the ability to interact with every one of the restaurants that is being put on your service, right? And you have the ability to interact or to like maintain a relationship with like your delivery people and with your customers. Right? What ended up happening with some delivery services is that like as they expanded, restaurants were having their menus being put online for delivery without being consulted ahead of time. Right? So you'd run into like all kinds of weird stuff, like maybe the restaurant already does delivery, right? Why is like they have paid delivery people? Why is their menu online, right? Why are other delivery people coming in to do the thing? Like that's just weird, right? Now we're losing money. Also, maybe the menu's out of date. Like I personally know people who run restaurants who have had out of date menus put online, right, without their consent, where the prices were, they were higher than they used to be. Like they lowered their prices in the past couple months, and whoever had originally stolen the menu like didn't count for that, right? And that's the kind of stuff that like they ended up calling, but like this had been going on for months at this point, right? Like it had been going on for months, and they call and they're like, oh, like what's going on? And a company like that particular company that does the delivery, like they have the ability to just handle these like off cases whenever somebody notices, right? But they just keep rolling and expanding without thinking about the effect that they're having on like small businesses that are thousands of kilometers away, right? And I don't blame them for it. Like it's really hard to like sit in an office and think about, oh, like how's somebody all the way in British Columbia going to feel if I'm over in Silicon Valley? Like I'm not really going to care, to be honest, right? Like I can't expect people to care. And so I'm here, like I'm interested in like seeing if maybe over time there's like a movement towards like smaller solutions to like local problems, right? Or like open source solutions that like communities can like co-opt and like take on and customize, right? So when we talk about like Twitter, there are things like Mastodon, right? And so Mastodon is like a Twitter clone, but it's a decentralized Twitter clone, right? It's an instance that you can run as a community. Like the three of us, maybe we really like talking with each other. We could spin up a Mastodon instance, and it's like our own private Twitter, right? And that on its own is pretty cool. But the real power of Mastodon is in its like decentralized aspect, where you can federate between instances. And what that means is like I can start my own Mastodon community here in Vancouver, and I could keep it locked to Vancouver, like to just that one website. Or say there's somebody in Minneapolis and they start a Mastodon instance, we can follow each other, and our messages stay like can travel between instances as we consent to them, right? As we, the community who run the instance, consent to it. So it's pretty cool. It's neat technology, and I think there's a huge range of applications for this kind of stuff, right? For making software that can be run locally, that can be pretty complicated, right? That serves a particular group of people. So you see with Mastodon, every instance is moderated by the community, but since the code is open source, right? And since like you get to run your own thing, a lot of people will customize it. Right? There's one called a Friend Camp that is, I think it's somebody in Portland started an instance, but they like coded up special features for it for their friends. And there's like all kinds of weird stuff. And so far, I've only seen this sort of limited to the social networking. Friend Camp, awesome. I've seen it limited to sort of like the social networking sphere. So there's all kinds of like Twitter clones and Facebook clones. There's a YouTube clone called, I call them clones, but they're just analogs. There's a thing called PeerTube, which is a decentralized YouTube, right? And the benefits of this stuff is like, We get to own our data. We get to choose what features we want to incorporate into the stuff, and nobody can shut us down, right? Or like nobody can shut the entire network down because they're individual nodes. Right? And I think it would be really cool to take that technology, this like federation between like community-owned instances, and translate that over to things like Uber, and translate that over to things like food delivery, where maybe communities can host their own ride-sharing instances. Right? Like, why does my data about me, going from the bar to my house or to the movie theater and whatever through Uber, like why does that need to live in the hands of somebody in Silicon Valley?
Have you ever been to Austin? So Austin has, I mean, I've seen these pop up in a lot of cities. Austin's a great example. They have Austin Rides, where they've created their own local. One of the things I think about a lot is like, I generally believe the free market works. I'm an entrepreneur. Like I'm pretty much about trying to leverage the free market and the opportunities in the free market to try to do well, like do good for people. Like that's generally my premise of like, so we'll call it social capitalism for the moment, barring a better term. But like one of the things I think about a lot is a lot of these localized initiatives, small initiatives that are potentially stronger in purpose, they have the burden of getting beyond a set level of critical mass in the free market for the free market to ultimately choose them. And I think what happens is, as you see more of this more centralized approach, there's more that goes into it, whether it's investment or just buy-in because of ease of use, that it creates an inevitably more complicated burden. And so I struggle to find a method in which technology can solve that, because I think inevitably, as we said earlier, as we add more technology, it gets harder to use. As it gets harder to use, there's less adoption. Less adoption means we don't, bridge the burden of proof, I guess we'll call it, within the free market. And that leads me back to the roads of like technologists doing profitable things that are good for people and being as empathetic as they can to their users, and being able to opt out of circumstances where they know their standards are being compromised, whether that's their standards and obligation to their customer, to their community, or in some cases their employer. I mean, I think that does come back to a free market opportunity to be able to opt out of the things that you want to participate in. And I don't think that means that like you have to be particularly libertarian or in any other sort of like realm. I think it's just like pretty rational to consider the like burden of proof needed to get enough buy-in for something to become a norm, right?
Totally. Yeah. And one of the things that I kind of struggle with a lot personally is just that like I think all this stuff is really cool, right? Like I think Mastodon is really cool, and now that I'm looking to write Austin, like that looks pretty neat as well, right? And there's all these like small initiatives. I definitely struggle personally with seeing like you said, just the will this stuff be adopted, right? And will it survive in the free market? And is there the capital sort of like incentive for people to invest in the development of this kind of stuff? I think that's where I sort of see like a long-term goal of educating people on technology, and hoping that like by increasing the general awareness of what technology is capable to do and what we're able to just achieve in small, just sort of smaller cases, I'm hoping that makes its way into things like the municipal and the provincial governments here in Canada to be able to like put money into like nonprofit approaches to solving these things, right? And that's something that like I'm totally aware personally is like a huge pipe dream. Like it's just I don't see that happening anytime soon, right? But like my dream is like, oh well, like the greater Vancouver area will like combine forces to create like a decentralized Uber clone or something, right? Like I just think that would be really cool. And sometimes I feel like the empowerment of technology and like the cool factor of technology and the fact that like it brings us together sort of gets lost in the haze, and it very much needs to be there, but the haze of capitalism and the haze of the fact that like this stuff needs to make money, and like it needs to reach a critical mass to make money and to have an impact. And I'm I'm definitely constantly struggling with that in my mind.
I think what you're describing is a big splash in a small pond, which I think is perfectly fine. Like whether it's bootstrapping a business in the private sector to do well by a smaller number of people, or it's open source just for the purposes of good. Like all of this is relative, and we talk about this a lot in our business because we switched from a more practical bootstrap model to a venture model. What are the incentives there? The incentives are to build a big business, but that doesn't mean you have to build a business that doesn't have, do well by people and enable them. And I think the core of any product at the end of the day, correct me if I'm wrong, but the core of any product is to help a person feel good and like achieve a thing. And like to your point, that's going to be harder to do as you grow. So set a relative aspiration for what kind of impact you want to the zone, the area, the distribution, I guess. But I think when you put things on these broader stages, things like Twitter, things like government even, the burden becomes quite high, right? And you need to have a lot of people rallying around a set of initiatives. I think something like open source is a good example of a conduit for this as well.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think by and large, like the products that are being developed and just the companies that are out there are made up of good people, and people want to do good. And like you said, like the core aim of a product is generally to help someone, right, or to solve a problem for someone. Yeah, like I don't at all disagree with that, and like I kind of hope for a world where things continue branching in that way, but where like the goal doesn't need to be mass adoption. Like it doesn't need to be this like, oh, like we went worldwide, right? Like that's I hope for a world where we can focus a little bit closer to like our immediate area, where like I can be a bit more honest to myself that I do understand the people around me more than I understand the people who are even like across the country. Like it feels disingenuous for me to say to myself that like, oh, I know what's good for everyone. And I know that people don't go into creating businesses and creating products with that mindset, but I think that that's something that just happens through technology. Is that like tech in abstract, I guess, tends to have this like, this is the solution, and that this is again like neutral and apolitical. I think I'm like talking myself in circles.
Well, maybe we coin a new term today, right? Maybe this is a good way to conclude this. What I heard today is applying the concepts of technical debt to social impact debt. So as a business is growing, it's incurring this idea of debt with the impact it's making, and it should have a place in the backlog. It should be considered in line with the other kinds of debt, technical debt, business debt. Hey, financial debt is a thing in a lot of private businesses as well. Maybe it should be rationalized like that. One thing I would encourage people to look at, because I've looked into this a bit from the company and corporate side, is in BC, and I think in other places, we have what's called a B class. It's a type of corporation that has a triple bottom line. You're accountable to your shareholders, you're accountable to your finances and these sorts of things, but you also have a degree of accountability right in your corporate documents, your notices of incorporation, which that state the actual intentions of your corporate good. So you're effectively, your shareholders are accepting that tertiary sort of like avenue for incorporating that as a priority into the business direction, management, leadership, and governance, right? And I think that's a really good idea. I think the reason that the B Corp was created was to try to better align these ideas of social impact with the interests of investors and shareholders, to help funnel resources into businesses without having to say like, look, it's either social impact or it's profitable or it's venture, right? And therefore create this sort of compromise where businesses that do have a purposeful goal can ultimately still find the funding, the resources, and the trajectory they need to get past a burden. And I believe this is something that exists in other places. I just only really know about it here in Vancouver through a couple companies that I've personally know the founders of, who specifically set the business up both for venture but also for the purposes of doing well. And this was a really popular, recently it became a much more popular method for how people incorporate their business.
That's super cool. So B corporation.
Yeah, it's and there's like two avenues to it too. I think you can actually start it out as your legal document, instead of, as your incorporation docs, or you can actually be certified by them by going through this process of looking at all aspects of the business. And yeah, I think it is a really interesting another I think format. Some startups in the tech scene that we've seen is there's kind of a, there's 1% for the planet, and then there's like a similar organization does like 1% of your equity, and that's like dedicated to nonprofits or causes or however you want to dictate it. And so it's interesting seeing some of those models, and I think it'd be really interesting to see continuation of that and more emerge that help build that into the, like, bake it into the cake, not just be the icing on top.
No, this is awesome. I'm definitely going to take a look through this. I think there's just so much power in these like organizational structures, I guess, that allow people to express themselves both, through, like you said, you want to be successful as a business, but you want to do well. I've found it really cool lately to, it's in the past like 6 months to a year or so, like explore all the different kinds of organizations that there are. Being like, my background's in computer science and education, and I was really embarrassed by myself, like for not knowing very much about business whatsoever at all. And I've been exploring co-ops, like the cooperative structure recently.
Yeah.
And I've found that's just super, super, super cool. It doesn't seem to work for like everything, but there's definitely like a really broad range of kind of.
I'm actually I'm a shareholder in two of those actually, but it's more in the real estate space, because you can also use it to structure real estate. And this is where I've seen this idea emerge, whether it's Addy here in Vancouver, who are helping people become homeowners for as little as $1, or it's these older structures like what's called an undivided interest property. The co-op structures actually got applied to fair housing quite a bit, and I think it was something that I went into quite skeptic, but I think it works quite well. But there is definitely a burden of distributed interests that need to be managed to make sure it works well. It's different than in a corporation, because in a true corp, or like a C corp, or even a B class, there's somebody who ultimately is the arbiter and has a fiduciary duty to support the shareholders' best interests. But the problem I had with the co-op is it's consensus driven, and sometimes it's really hard to get to consensus. So that's the burden that you have to overcome in a co-op structure. But at least there's a shared set of responsibilities, and there needs to be some level of management that's implemented still, like a board of managers who still do that. But it's much more distributed to that sense. But you still have a carved out set of just like rights that are afforded to you, and then a different set of rights that you have to properly govern across these different kind of cooperative interests, right?
Yeah, it's super cool, and there's like all kinds of different co-ops. I was under the impression up until recently that like, okay, there's co-op, like the workers or like the customers like own the thing or whatever. That was like my high level kind of that's what I understood. And then I took this I think it's Van City along with BC Co-op. They run a course on like co-op entrepreneurship. So I took that recently. It's really cool. They bring in a bunch of speakers from like all kinds of different co-ops around the Lower Mainland. Actually, there were a couple of people from Alberta and stuff that came too. It was really cool to see like all the different kinds of co-ops there are. Because there's like worker-owned co-ops. There's like the like customer-owned co-ops, and there's like co-ops that are owned by businesses. Like businesses will form co-ops. And you're not finding there's a brewery co-op that's a bunch of breweries in Vancouver get together to form a co-op. And it's not like individual people, but like the breweries themselves, which exist independently. I think each of them is just like they're just a company that they'll got together to form a bigger co-op for like special events and stuff. Plus, there seems to be a movement for since there's like lots of freelancers nowadays. Like I do contract work. I like picking up just kind of freelance contracts and choosing my hours and whatever. And I found that like there's a whole bunch of people that just kind of will get together in groups of like 3 or 4.
What's that one? Start.coop. Sorry to interrupt. That one looks interesting.
Yeah, cool.
I didn't even know
there's
there was
an accelerator for co-ops
and
for co-op startups.
a TLD too. I didn't know that there was a .coop.
Yeah.
I'm going on a domain buying spree after this call.
Yeah. So there's this super interesting. Actually, it ties back to Mastodon. There's a worker-owned software dev co-op called Field Train, and they're Portland-based. So Field Train, I believe it's like 3 people, maybe 2. Feel like FEEL. Yeah. And
I see.
It's a couple developers, and they take on contracts. They're a dev shop, but they're formed as a co-op, and they have like a little mission letter and everything. It's really cool. The person who like one of the person who runs it, Darius Kazemi, he's the person who runs. They're the person who runs the Mastodon instance friend camp that I mentioned earlier. And they've got a whole thing on how to run your own technology cooperative.
Distributed systems.
And this seems to be a movement.
Yeah,
that's popping up in at least the Pacific Northwest. I've seen a bunch of them in California, and I know that there are a couple in Vancouver.
Yeah, I've heard of startups trying to form this model around different ideas in San Francisco before.
Blockchain, DAOs, like there's a ton of this stuff that's popped up.
There's one called Brave in Vancouver.
Yeah, the browser company, right? Started by Brendan Itch, the creator of JavaScript.
Oh, no, I think Brave, if you go brave.coop,
okay.
What they do is they build like overdose prevention technology.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So and they're structured as a cooperative, and they're super cool. Just over here in Vancouver.
Doesn't Brave the browser sort of also imply some of this? I mean, that's where I thought you were going with that, but it has a little bit less of a social impact, but it's at very least a cooperative model for like, I guess your attention. We talked about earlier, it's hard to get your attention. Like their model for the browser is instead of people serving you ads and just like the corporations getting money for your attention, their idea, as I remember it, was that if you use their browser and somebody serves you ads, you get a piece of that money.
Oh yeah,
something.
You know what, I actually
something like that.
Brave. That sounds pretty funny.
I think that's where they started because they had this idea of a Brave token. They might have just went back to a more secure ad blocking kind of model value prop. But originally there was a lot built into this around the idea that like if you're being served ads, you should get paid for that. And I think, that created this cooperative between like the users of the browser and then them. But it does seem like from their website now, maybe they brought it back a little bit to just simply, equal Flimper Fire, like tokens for just browsing. That's the concept. Is like more of like a rewards generation system with the BAT token. And so there's like,
that's pretty neat.
Yeah, like originally it was meant to be a little bit more monetary, but I think probably it was challenging to get over the hurdles of regulation with tokenization and all that. But like the idea of creating some sort of cooperative interest between advertisers and users, I think is huge because personally there's nothing I dislike more than ads on the internet. I think it's one of the most just like zero value things that I can experience as a user. As a business owner, I get it because I want to reach users and try to communicate my value proposition, but there's just so much of my attention that's not used well between ads and other things, right?
I definitely say that the user experience as a person experiencing ads sucks. It's the worst thing. This is cool. I'd heard about Brave, but I'd never really looked too much into it because I just thought it was just another browser. But I'll take a look at that because it sort of encapsulates everything that I feel should go into tech, which is that consent, right? Like I consent to the advertisement. So fine, you're telling me to do the advertisement. Yeah. Like that's like, all right, I'm gonna opt into it, and you feel as a user like the people who made the product are treating you like an agent, right? Like they're treating you like somebody who has power over
A
themselves.
shareholder that they have a fiduciary duty to bring it back to that actual B class, that co-op model is like,
I like that.
That is exactly what that tries to establish legally, is like, here is a value proposition that we have a shared set of interests in, and I have a fiduciary duty to these, not just the bottom line, meaning like here's your money, but I also have a bottom line to, you know, make sure your attention is used well, your screen time, I'm not leaving you out in the cold, these other things. And I think the best companies have to do that well. The best technologists have to do that well too.
Exactly. And like, I can say, in all honesty, I can say that like sometimes I feel really ignorant on this kind of stuff, right? And I feel really ignorant on like that whole process. And this is, for me, like I can't really speak for everyone, but like I can say that through like my education, like just going through computer science, like this was never really something that came up, right? Like my journey through computer science is just like, oh, this is how you code, numerical analysis, whatever, like linear optimization. It's math. You can do things with it. That's cool. You can make a lot of money. And I was going through it. I'm like, oh no, this is cool. Then there's like an elective course on like social impact of technology. And everyone who took that course was just like, oh, it's like an easy A. Like you write a couple things about like drones are bad and you get an A. And I mean, they're right. Like the prof gave everybody like high grades. She didn't really hurt anyone GPA wise. But I went to every one of those classes and I felt the passion, but I still felt like I wasn't like getting there. And sometimes I wish like that stuff had been more integrated into my education, because like I feel, and this is again very much just me, sometimes I feel very much like a tool. Like as a programmer, like I have the ability to like build this thing, right? But I feel like I'm very much in the hands of, you know, the people who are funding me or the people that I'm working for, and deciding like what that stuff is actually being used for, right? And I can say that that feels like that's a big part of being a programmer, is just kind of like leaving your thoughts at the door. You show up like, oh, here's some GitHub issues that I got to tackle. I've got a sprint meeting today, whatever. Like you just kind of get into that and you become a really great programmer, but feel distanced from like this side of things. If that makes any sense.
Absolutely. We try to advocate for a more entrepreneurial kind of mindset within programming, because I think even freelancing the way you're doing that, right? Like it speaks to the idea that you can, you know, step out of that box and take agency in how you allocate your energy. Being more entrepreneurial as a programmer, I think, is a great way to do that. But if you don't have the mechanisms in place to then also like align with the value creation model that you're looking for and the incentives that you're looking to align with, it becomes a very challenging environment. And you know, I've said this before. I mean, Tristan and I have both been entrepreneurs and doing startups for a while. Like it's a challenging journey, and I don't know that that's a burden that every developer wants to pursue. But if you can adopt some of that agency that exists in entrepreneurship into how you think about where you allocate your energy, and ultimately as an entrepreneur, you're investing your time, your money, and your energy, and that's what's most important, is mostly your time and your energy. And I think that's something that applies also to software engineering. So it's like, if I'm going to invest into a set of virtues that don't work for me, I can opt out of that. I can choose to sort of allocate my energy differently. And then it's just about creating awareness around where people can find these frameworks that they can align with, these value creation models that they align with, which might be more sustainable, might be more impact driven. But the great thing is there's a lot of them to pick from. It's just a matter of kind of finding them and doing the research.
Yeah, I think the entrepreneur is a lot of times undervalued, and you know, it's sexy to be an entrepreneur, but the entrepreneurship doesn't talk about as much. But that's a huge component of being an advocate within your own organization, helping change things, helping make awareness of things, and saying yes or no to projects if you're in a larger corporation. There's a lot of, I think, ability that you have to advocate within organizations that should be looked at as more of that, that entrepreneurial hero. Well, Nima, I think it was great to have you. I think we've went way out of our time, but it was such an interesting conversation. I'm going to put all these links. We're going to have a long link list on the description in the video. And please, if anyone out there watching, if there's ideas on topics or people you'd like to have on the show, as always, put it in the comments. Thank you so much, Nima. It was a pleasure to have you.
Oh, no problem. Yeah. Can I shill a couple things?
Shill a couple things. Let's do it.
Yeah. All right. So first is just a book that I'm reading right now, which is really cool. It's called The Death of the Gods. It's by an author named Carl Miller. Carl Miller is one of the people who, I guess, runs a thing called Demos, DEMOS, I think it is. And it's a think tank in the UK, and they look at how like power and technology are intertwined. Really cool book. It's a series of kind of experiences that he kind of goes through around the world, looking at tech and power, both at like a personal level and at a kind of higher abstract level. So there's that. Yeah, that's the one about Penguin, Death of the Gods. So this is really cool. And then, I mean, the other thing to shill is just that I freelance.
Yeah.
If anyone needs content.
Where can we find
like
you?
Curriculum.
Where can people find you online?
I have, I mean, my portfolio, like it's just n11o.com. But my name is pretty unique. So if you look up Nima Boscarino, best place to find me is like Twitter, or just email me directly anytime. And
we'll throw you in the description too.
Totally, yeah. I'm always looking for
smart, worldly mind on your team.
What kind of projects are you looking for?
I love working on kind of like sort of quirky things that play around with the way that people interact with each other. I've been working with a local prof on a volunteering platform for neighborhoods. Anything that gets people talking to each other is a lot of fun for me. And specifically tech-wise, like I do a lot of just front end, back end. I'm not a DevOps guy, so I should probably put that out there. I know nothing.
That's all right. Yeah.
But and education. If it has to do with teaching people and empowering people through education and tech, and that's it for me. I work with an organization called Canada Learning Code, so I'd shill them as well with people.
Well, here's what I want to do. I want to follow up with you and talk about the curriculum stuff, because we've got a lot of different ideas about different curriculum stuff that we could definitely pick your brain on. And
let's do it.
All right, cool. Awesome.
Sweet.
Well, thank you so much. That's it for the Op Show for today. And Nima, again, huge pleasure to have you.
It was a huge pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me to be on. This was a ton of fun. It was really nice chatting with both of you.